I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're in the light world, or maybe we're in the dark world, as I explore and rank the dungeons of The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past for the SNES. Finally, we have made it to the first truly revolutionary sequel in the Zelda series, as A Link to the Past's top-down formula of varied dungeon design, epic bosses, and a sprawling world to explore reinvigorated the systems of the original NES game and overhauled them for a more modern audience. And it hasn't aged a bit. You can pick up and play this classic with the SNES Nintendo Switch Online app and go at it. It's easy to follow, has a few hidden secrets, and with 12 different dungeons to explore, with each feeling surprisingly unique, we're in for a treat. So, let's get to it. All 12 dungeons in The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, ranked. And let me know your favorite dungeon in the comments below. Someone had to come last, and after much deliberation, I picked the Desert Palace to bring up the rear in today's ranking. This is the second dungeon in the game, and can only be unlocked by collecting the Book of Medora from the local town library, and using it to translate the Hylian script outside the palace. Once you enter, you're greeted with sand-filled floors and a surprisingly open-ended amount of exploration. The first half of this dungeon revolves around a gargantuan open room that snakes around a series of corridors, and in various corners you can find doorways leading off into different branches of the palace. You'll have to contend with classic levers that will dig up from the sand and home in on Link, as well as the new red devil ant enemies that appear in sandy whirlpools and attempt to fire at Link. Perhaps the most dangerous new enemy, though, are the Beamos turrets. These are placed throughout the palace, asking you to solve puzzles and defeat enemies while an automated turret threatens to shoot at you if it hits your line of sight. Now, as a kid, I found these very hard to play around, but now I'm pretty comfortable with their inclusion. Without them, this dungeon would be unmemorable, because it doesn't really do anything else to stand out. The dungeon item you obtain here is the Power Glove, needed to access the back half of the dungeon, which you can find by using a different dungeon exit and heading out into the overworld. I think that's a neat concept, but there is another dungeon later in the game that actually utilizes the overworld layout as a real part of the dungeon. Here, you just grab a quick piece of heart and then head into the nearby cave. The last part of the dungeon doesn't do much for me. There's a flying tile room I always found fun, if a bit slow, and the rest of the rooms are enemy gauntlets with a few hidden keys for good measure, all leading to the dungeon boss, Lan Mola. Regulars of my channel know that I don't go into the bosses in my dungeon rankings, as I prefer to rank them in a separate video, but I will say that thematically, the fight makes a lot of sense for the dungeon, and is a satisfying conclusion to the palace. It's not bad, which really sets the tone for the entire game. It's just not memorable. I'm going to be completely real with you all when I say that as the Zelda series progressed, I found the final dungeons of each game to be steadily less and less interesting, because the regular dungeons start introducing fun gimmicks and settings, yet the final dungeon almost never manages to match them. Ganon's Tower is my number 11 dungeon precisely because I feel it doesn't match what the rest of the roster managed to achieve, a sense of individuality. Ganon's Tower has the trope where all of its challenges are made up of enemies, traps, and even bosses from the past dungeons, reused to show you just how far Link has come in his quest. From that perspective, I fully think it hits the mark. But by this point in the game, I've already gone through 11 other dungeons and fatigue starts to set in. Yet Ganon's Tower is then arguably one of the most complex challenges the game has in store. The first half feels more traditionally dungeon-like, with Link exploring one of two possible paths through the basement to find the big key and the red tunic. There are enemy gauntlets, puzzles, hookshot rooms, and even a reused boss in the Armos Knights to contend with, complete with an icy floor to make the battle tougher. But then the second half of the dungeon is just a linear series of rooms where you kill enemies, move on, kill enemies, move on, take on mini-bosses, move on, Moldorm rematch, kill me now. I've always been more drawn to dungeons that have an entirely new take or gimmick on the game. Take a look at Zelda 2's Great Palace that I ranked last week. Even then, that game was adding in new enemy types we hadn't seen before, like the Fokker, to give the player this sense that they had stumbled upon somewhere truly dangerous. Zelda 1 had the Patra and the Lanmola, enemies that hadn't been used in prior dungeons, so Ganon's Tower by comparison has no new enemy types to surprise you. I guess you could say the Lionels outside on Death Mountain count? Why didn't we put some of them in the dungeon? I don't know. If that's a trope you enjoy, Ganon's Tower will likely rank much higher on your personal list, but for me, it doesn't hold that appeal, and holds it back from my top 10. And just barely squeaking into my top 10, we have Hyrule Castle, the first dungeon you explore in the game. Now for the purposes of this list, I'm including both visits, the first where you rescue Princess Zelda at the start of the game, as well as the visit following you collecting the Master Sword where you storm your way up to Aghanim. Being your first test, Hyrule Castle is designed to teach you how to use your sword skills against basic knights and tougher foes. Since you've yet to collect the Master Sword, you have to get up close and personal with the guards to defeat them. And for me, this meant learning the harsh lesson that my sword swings are not as wide as I think they are in this game. I took a lot of extra stupid damage because of this, and found myself close to death. How embarrassing. Rescuing Zelda from the castle's basement is fun enough, and the way the game teaches you about combat as well as utilizing your environment, such as the bottomless pits, was a nice touch. All leading to a fun little sewer escape sequence where you have to use the lantern to spot enemies and light torches, allowing you to escape to Sanctuary. It's not a long experience, but it's a fun one. The second visit is of course more intense, as you've just obtained the Master Sword, and are now able to break the seal on Upper Hyrule Castle. This does lead to a similar experience to the second half of Ganon's Tower, where your main goal is to kill every enemy you see and make your way up to Aghanim. But in this instance, it works far better thematically. You've just been given this insane power-up with the Master Sword, so of course the game is going to put you in a scenario where you can make use of the extra damage and the sword beams. Cutting through Hyrule's Royal Guard is some of the most satisfying gameplay in the series. Everything crumples like paper, and you never really feel in danger despite the enemies rising in challenge. Not even the good old spiky ball and chain soldiers had anything on my skill, so that's why Hyrule Castle beats out Ganon's Tower. Here, defeating these enemies that have hunted you for the first third of the game feels like overcoming an obstacle, whereas in Ganon's Tower, the charm has worn off and you just want to be done and defeat Ganon. This dungeon also has a great climax, with the sealing away of Princess Zelda, followed by Link being drawn back into the Dark World, along with the reveal that there are 7 more major dungeons to explore. What a moment! Next up on our list, we have the final dungeon you visit on your quest to collect the pendants, the Tower of Hyrule. In terms of the dungeon design, I love the sense of verticality that's presented, and how it actually relates to the gameplay and puzzle design when you're forced to figure out how to drop from a higher floor to reach the dungeon's hidden item, the Moon Pearl. Which, speaking of, the lead up to this dungeon is one of the game's best, forcing you to traverse the rocky Death Mountain, only to find yourself drawn into the Dark World, where you become a very adorable looking bunny, but with absolutely no way to defend yourself. Just having this glimpse of an entirely different realm is quite the shock. The dungeon itself, however, has the issue of simply being too easy to complete. The Eastern and Desert Palaces were also easy dungeons you've completed up to this point, but I think the Tower of Hyrule being a tower that uses floors instead of actual rooms means that you can breeze through a majority of the switch-based puzzles exceptionally quickly. It takes less time to reach the boss of this dungeon than it takes to find the bow and arrow in the Eastern Palace, and that's a bit of a damning issue. Other games in the series, such as Link's Awakening, and even another dungeon in this game, do the vertical idea a lot better. But despite this, I really like the puzzle design here, with the red and blue switches, the floor stars that change the layout of the rooms, and the enemies that are purposefully designed to knock you back when you attack, so you have to position yourself very carefully to avoid accidentally flying yourself into a hole. all leading to another boss that definitely fits the theme of the dungeon, complete with the ability to knock you down and reset the fight. That's a topic for next week's video, but I have to respect that this is one of the few dungeons in any Zelda game where I actually think the boss is more likely to game over you more than the dungeon itself. In my experience, it's usually the other way around. And rounding out our Light World dungeons, we have the Eastern Palace coming in at number 8. It shouldn't come as a shock that the Dark World dungeons simply have the edge when it comes to memorability and challenge, but I have to give props to the Eastern Palace for being able to suck us all in with its well-designed layout and challenging foes. Unlike previous Zelda games, A Link to the Past is able to introduce two major differences to the top-down dungeon formula. The first is the multiple floors, as the final third of the dungeon is on floor 2, and that is something that just wasn't a thing in the past games, as well as the ability to have multiple levels on the same screen. You can go downstairs and find yourself passing underneath walkways or bridges, something that must have been mind-blowing to kids at the time. For some reason, I always remember the main hall where you'd have to dodge the cannonballs being fired down the corridor and hope you don't get hit by the giant one that covers the entire way forwards. A part of me wishes they'd taken that concept and utilized it a little bit more, as it's only revisited once in a room just before the boss, although that is a fun one. Outside of that, the palace is all about teaching the player the ins and outs of dungeon design, including navigation, meaning exploring every path available, as well as defeating enemies, which often makes chests appear, such as how you obtain the big key. You're free to go to the left side of the dungeon or the right side very early on, but ultimately you will wrap around and find what you need to find. In that sense, the dungeon can seem quite linear, but without feeling linear. In that moment, you're just exploring, but in reality, the developers have tailor-made the path you have to take to ensure that you find the chest that needs the big key, then you have to work your way around to find said big key, and then there's a shortcut straight back to that chest with the bow and arrow. Speaking of the bow and arrow, I like that it becomes a vital tool for taking down specific enemy types in the following rooms, such as Igor statues and even the boss fight at the end of the palace. It's refreshing after 2 games where items were mainly needed to access new dungeons, to see that this time around, many of the dungeons have items that are suited towards their puzzles and combat. It's a predictable formula, but god if I love it. What better way to showcase the utility of a new tool than to have it be a vital part of your boss-killing strategy? If I can just take a moment of your time, I'm trying to reach 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2023, and now I'm back from summer break, I know we can do it. Look at how many of you aren't subscribed, so be sure to parry that subscribe button for more gaming countdowns every Wednesday and Saturday. Back to the video. From this point on, the rankings are going to get difficult. I have been into Zelda dungeon countdowns ever since like 2010. So I've seen the Dark World dungeons getting ranked in every position known to mankind. So however this goes, please remember it's just my opinion. So my least favourite dungeon of the 7 is Thieves' Town, and let me explain why. I think this dungeon is really hard carried by its theme, being a hidden base of rogues looking to rob anyone who stumbles into the Dark World blind. And this concept is pushed to its natural limit when, after rescuing a fair maiden from the holding cells below, you must escort her to safety. Only safety in this means taking her to the boss room where, if you've blown up a roof above, a great puzzle by the way, it's revealed the girl is actually the leader of the thieves blind. This moment is this dungeon in a nutshell, but the actual traversal of the level to get to that point just doesn't quite do it for me. The majority of this area is split into these 3 gigantic halls that you first enter, and you're able to find all 3 major dungeon items there, the map, the compass, and the big key. It feels like the game front-loads the important objects, and thus the rest of the dungeon feels a bit less exciting as a result. The main new item you gain, the Titan's Mitt, allows you to pick up the heaviest types of rocks, but it isn't even required to complete the dungeon, despite being needed for future Dark World exploration. They could have very easily had the path to the room where you have to bomb the ceiling of the boss room to let the sunlight in be blocked by a Titan's Mitt rock, which would have made the item worth collecting, and given the player a big hint to return there in case anybody doesn't figure out the puzzle. For some reason, this dungeon's other main gimmick are conveyor belts. They push in a specific direction and can make movement very difficult. It's a good obstacle, but not a fun obstacle, if that makes any sense. Also, shout out to this room in the lower floor that is just there to trap you if you use the Titan's Mitt to check it. For a dungeon that tried to make a majority of its exploration focused around the 4 great rooms at the start, I just think there are other dungeons on this list that handle the concept of having a large central room much better. At number 6, we have the 3rd dungeon of the Dark World, Skull Woods, which I often see in contention for favourite dungeon from A Link to the Past because of the way it handles its main gimmick. See, this dungeon isn't a temple or a cave, it's a forest, the dark version of the Lost Woods, and as such, the overworld itself has become a part of the traversal of the dungeon. By finding holes above ground to drop down into the caverns below, Link has to make his way through the twisty-turny temple to secure the next maiden. In terms of that progression, this dungeon works wonders. It doesn't hold your hand or even give you an obvious path forwards. You'll have to loop back to previous rooms from new entrances, and if you hit a dead end, figure out where in the woods you can go to make that dead end a pathway forwards. The first half of the dungeon is solely based on finding the fire rod, which allows Link to then burn down the obstacle blocking off the second part of the dungeon, and this is the sequence I enjoy. You don't have to visit every room, and I feel like I did things in an order the game didn't fully expect, as by the time I reached the fire rod, I felt like there were still so many areas to explore. It's a weird feeling, as normally, I enjoy when dungeons force you to visit every room they have on offer. But for Skull Woods, with its overworld component and its hostile atmosphere, that feeling is flipped on its head and I love it. It doesn't help that you're constantly being assailed by wall masters who drop from the ceiling with malicious intent, and they don't stop spawning either, as far as I can tell. If you're grabbed, you'll be taken back to the last entrance you entered, so for the first half of the dungeon, it's a fun little gimmick. For the second half of the dungeon, it's annoying, as that's the point where everything becomes a linear run through various tough setups to get to the boss. And oh boy, I will talk about my disdain for Mothula next week, but if you're not coming in here with multiple healing potions, you are doing something wrong. The difficulty spikes up in the second half of this dungeon, and thus it feels like a tale of two halves. The first half being this great overworld dungeon exploration, the second half being me stuck beneath this bridge because this is fun navigation, right? The other Dark World dungeons to me have more going for them, but I do get why someone would consider Skull Woods their favourite dungeon. We've made it to our top 5, and one of the dungeons I alluded to when talking about Thieves' Town is Misery Mire, the 6th dungeon of the Dark World. This is a fetid swamp temple filled to the brim with the most interesting of traps, some tricky to reach chests, and a surprise redemption for one of my most hated enemies in Zelda 1. That's right, this level introduces Wizrobes to the SNES, and with a better controlling Link and more impressive enemy AI, they're completely bearable now. They work exactly like they do in the first game, but we don't have that annoying blue variant that can phase through you at will. The level itself feels like Thieves' Town in that you're dealing with similar dangers, conveyor belts, traps like the spiked floors, and large focal rooms you keep coming back into. While many dungeons have this aspect down, I think Misery Mire's main room is my favourite of the type, because you really do have the option to enter and exit in whatever order you want. I found the big chest early on, but didn't have the big key to open it, so I had to go back to the main room. I searched every doorway and checked every path I could, because I feel this dungeon doesn't give you anything easily. The torch puzzle on the upper floor is a real highlight, as you have to light torches in 2 different rooms to progress, all the while dealing with Wizrobes trying to blast you with magic. I also need to give a shout out to how you enter the dungeon. Similar to the Desert Palace in the Light World, you have to use an item to unlock the entrance, in this case, the Ether Medallion. Doing so awakens the dungeon entrance, which is an ancient swampy sculpture that rises from the depths, allowing you to enter. I just wish there was some kind of swampy gimmick within the dungeon to tip it over the edge, because the boss fight with Vitreous has poison liquid in it. Where was that in the dungeon? Heck, even the dungeon item isn't usable here, instead being the required item for a future entry on this list. If you're into mazes, Misery Mire is perfect and should honestly be called Misery Maze, but for me, I just like dungeon gimmicks that feel more all-encompassing. And missing out on our top 3 by mere inches, we have the final regular dungeon of the game, Turtle Rock. To access this dungeon, you have to go to the light world and find the warp panel in the same area, which will bring you to the top of the dungeon's entrance. You must then use the Quake Medallion to open the turtle's skull, and admittedly, I do think the Quake Medallion is stupidly hidden. I don't understand how anyone would have figured out you have to throw a rock into this circle in the water. Oh my god, this is a Breath of the Wild Korok moment, holy crap. But once you've opened the turtle's maw, you can enter the dungeon and experience the weird abundance of Mario enemies within, from chain chomps to fire bars to pokies. The main gimmick are these floating rails where, using the Cane of Samaria you got from the previous dungeon, you can summon platforms to ride on. As long as there's a turn in the rail, you can point the platform in that direction, and this technique is used to great effect throughout the dungeon. From this early room where you have to light 4 fires and make it back to the starting area so you can get through the door into the next room before the fires go out, to this absolute insanity of a dark maze where your goal is to find a button in the center of the room and hold it down via the cane's power, all to open the door leading outwards. And I can confirm I almost died multiple times in here. I struggled with dodging the fire bars, but I really enjoyed the concept. On the first basement floor, we're also introduced to these pipes that warp you around the dungeon, which, while ultimately a linear experience, as the pipes are more for show than anything else, I like the fact that they're there. They feel like a missed opportunity in terms of puzzle design, but when the main focus of the dungeon is the Cane of Samaria, I can forgive. The dungeon item is the Mirror Shield, which allows you to reflect the projectiles of the laser eyes found throughout the dungeon. But beyond this, it is just a simple shield upgrade. I don't think the Mirror Shield comes into its own until the 3D games. Now, my main critique of this dungeon, and the reason it misses the top 3, is the sheer amount of magic usage required to complete it. You're at the whims of whether or not you can summon your Cane of Samaria blocks, so if you didn't bring a green potion and you're not confident on where to go, you may find yourself struggling. And you're also going to need a lot of magic for the boss fight, so really, just bring a green potion. Now, I did it without a magic potion, but I suspect many players aren't going to have that same level of ease that I had, especially younger players. But none of this takes away from how fantastic Turtles Rock is design-wise, and really showcases how far we've come from the NES dungeon era. If there was one palace that A Link to the Past had to nail, I'd say the first dungeon after you enter the Dark World is perhaps the most important. The Palace of Darkness has to set the scene for the rest of the game, providing you with a major step up in difficulty as you explore a more devious version of what used to be the Eastern Palace from earlier in the game. And I really like that a majority of the rooms do kind of have callbacks to the Eastern Palace's layout, kind of making you think, oh, I really am exploring a dark version of a location I've already conquered. Here, the focus is on exploration, with tons of different paths that need to be fully explored to collect all the keys and items needed to make it to the boss. There are chests you can see from very early on, but you won't be able to reach them without doing major exploration. And from minute 0, you can go left, right, or middle, with each path taking you on a different journey. Be it the left path to get a key, the right path to use a teleporter leading to an easily missable bombable wall that'll get you to the dungeon map, or perhaps you'll go down the center path to the main portion of the dungeon and find the big item chest before you've found the big key, forcing you to backtrack. I like this brief puzzle where, due to the large amount of bottomless pits in the dungeon, there's this one room you actually can fall down and you have to realize there's a change in the tile set, and this actually ultimately gets the player to the big key. Or what about this room filled to the brim with rupees, where you can see the boss store but with no current way to reach it? The item you obtain in this dungeon, the hammer, is vital for the rest of your exploration into the Dark World, and also this dungeon. It can slam down the red mole blocks, and can also knock over the terrapin enemies, allowing you to damage them. There's also a memorable moment with this game's version of the Gorias, who for some reason act as mimics that Link must defeat. The red Gorias require precise arrow timing to beat and can easily cause less experienced players to game over if they can't figure out the strategy. Hi, I'm less experienced players. I also really like this one statue you have to shoot to reveal the path forwards. It's barely even a puzzle, but cinematically it feels like you've discovered something exciting. The Palace of Darkness is also a fun dungeon when it comes to key collecting, or should I say, infamous. Because more often than not, players will end up missing one of the keys and find their way to the last few rooms blocked off. This happened to me because I missed the path to the dungeon map early on, but I've looked up info on this phenomenon, and this happens a lot to players in this specific palace. They just happen to miss a key, and I just really think that's cool. It adds to that feeling of exploration. I also appreciate that the boss of the palace is actually tied to one of the enemy types you can find here, the baby Helmasaurs, and that said boss requires the dungeon item to defeat. You know I always love that in 2D Zelda. The Palace of Darkness is a perfect intermediate dungeon and a great way to kick off the Dark World, but there are 2 more palaces that stand head and shoulders above the rest. Our Link to the Past dungeon runner-up goes to the Swamp Palace, the second dungeon of the Dark World and the first water dungeon of the franchise. Now, infamously, The Legend of Zelda has been critiqued for its water dungeons, with them being either love it or hate it locations that focus on gimmicks like raising or lowering water levels, changing the flow of water, etc. The Swamp Palace focuses on a few puzzles where you need to raise and lower water levels to progress, but unlike the 3D games, it's way easier to keep track of here due to the simplistic nature of the SNES. For the most part, it's actually quite linear, which to me is a help. I love that to even enter this dungeon, you have to solve a puzzle by entering the light world, draining the water from the lake outside, returning to the dark world, and then you'll see that that water will have flooded the entry room. It sets up the theme of the palace perfectly. The first half of the level revolves around collecting the big key needed to unlock the dungeon item, and contains a lot of flicking switches to flood corridors, as well as a small puzzle where you have to drop either down a left or right hole, with one leading to rupees and the other leading to said big key. It's where most of the water puzzles reside in this dungeon, and I found them really fun. It was pretty simple, I had to rack my brain a few times. I was challenged in a fun way. Then you reach the second half of the level where you get the dungeon item, and it's revealed to be a series staple and the debut of the hook shot. This item allows Link to fire at objects and enemies. Objects he'll pull himself towards, while enemies will be stunned or damaged by the attack. You have to use the hook shot to make it through the rest of the palace, and future dungeons after this as well. It's one of the most versatile items in the game, and honestly one of the most versatile items in gaming history. There is never not a moment where it's useful. I also have a soft spot for the room with the various waterfalls, as it actually reminds me of a similar setup in one of my favorite RPGs, Golden Sun, as you need to find the hidden passage behind one of them to progress. It's so simple, but hits that spot in every gamer's brain to check behind any waterfall for secrets, leading to a swimming room where you have to get a key before reaching the boss. And once again, while not a big factor in my rankings, having a boss that utilizes the item you've just obtained to defeat it will always be a plus for me. Good on you, Argus. The Swamp Palace is a water level done right, so it's ironic that it's only beaten by a different state of water. My favourite dungeon in A Link to the Past is the Ice Palace, the 5th dungeon you face in the Dark World, and the beginning of Zelda's long tradition of, honestly, having absolutely banger ice levels. To enter the palace, you have to head to the Great Fairy Fountain in the centre of Lake Hylia, and find the warp panel underneath a Titan's Mitt rock, which will take you to the dungeon's entrance. And I'll freely admit, my first time playing this game, I absolutely hated this dungeon. I found the ice physics frustrating, enemies did so much damage that I felt overwhelmed, and the layout was extremely confusing. It didn't help that my first time doing a full playthrough of A Link to the Past was on stream, so I had that extra pressure to do well. So imagine my surprise after dreading this dungeon that in this playthrough, I had a genuine blast. Discovering that the green penguins were incredibly weak to spin attacks was a great help, given those green slippery motherfuckers were the main reason I kept dying on my old playthrough. I found the maze-like layout of the dungeon more of a comfort than a hindrance, engaging with me to remember where I had been and where I needed to go. The idea of having to go down deep into the dungeon so I could then return to the upper floors via a different path to collect the big key was absolutely genius. And this dungeon also gives the fire rod some real use. We may have obtained it in Skull Woods, but it's the real star of the show in the Ice Palace, being the only item able to kill the Freezor enemies on the walls, and is required for the dungeon's boss too. I also like the introduction of the Stalfos Knights enemies that you have to attack then bomb to defeat. It's a mechanic that's reused in a few Zelda games, including I think Link's Awakening, though I think they should have had more health to make them more threatening. This truly is the palace of traps, with moving floors, ice physics, blades, bumpers, fire bars, shooting statues, even a few of those hazards that can turn you into your rabbit form, bottomless pits, and more. Yet I never felt overwhelmed. This is also the dungeon where you get one of the most useful items in the game, the blue mail, and I'm impressed A Link to the Past holds off for so long on giving Link an actual armor upgrade. But it makes obtaining it feel that much more rewarding after getting through the horrors of the palace itself, because everything does a lot of damage. I especially love the final puzzle where you have to push a specific block from a higher floor down to a lower floor so it can then activate a switch allowing you to progress, or using the hookshot to get over spike pits, or this giant room with ice physics, penguins, and hazards. It all feels like a lot, but ends up being extremely manageable in practice. Perhaps I just got used to the ice movement, or I just had an epiphany that I'm good at games when I'm not under any pressure. But the Ice Palace has such a unique way to progress, a solid grasp of its gimmicks, and acts as a great difficulty spike that is sorely needed after Thieves Town, that I cannot help but give it my #1 spot on this list. Well done. And that's that. Which dungeons from The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past are your favourite? Let me know down below and why. Be sure to parry that subscribe button to stay up to date on all my future videos every Wednesday and most Saturdays. My socials are on screen now, feel free to follow where you feel inclined. I'd recommend my Twitter or my Blue Sky if you have it. I also have a small Discord, if you consider joining, there is a link down below. A massive shout out to my patrons over on Patreon for supporting me for another month. Your support means the world, it really does. And I will see you guys next week for my boss ranking. Adios.